Okay, so I'm here to talk about borderline personality disorder, and my mantra is recovery is possible. Who am I? My name is Andrea Rosenhaft. I'm a licensed clinical social worker for over 20 years. Recovered from anorexia, major depressive disorder, and borderline personality disorder. I was diagnosed with all three in the late 1980s to 1990, when I was in my late 20s to age 30. I'm a published writer and blogger on the subject of mental health and recovery, and I have 5 years experience, just a little over 5 years experience, working for one of the leading healthcare managed care organizations. So what is borderline personality disorder? The focus is that it centers on the inability to manage emotions effectively, which means that people that are diagnosed with BPD can go from 0 to 60 in about a couple of minutes, really, as opposed to something like bipolar, where their mood shifts rapidly, but not that rapidly, more like in the matter of a couple of hours or even days. People with BPD have an intense fear of abandonment. They often feel empty inside and chaotic. To cope with emotions that seem intolerable, they self-harm, which is not to be confused with suicidality, mostly by cutting, sometimes by burning, sometimes by picking at skin, sometimes by pulling out hair. BPD is rarely diagnosed in isolation, often with other mood disorders like depression and anxiety disorders, often with other disorders that have kind of an impulsive nature to them, like bulimia. I was an exception actually with the anorexia, but bulimia is a more impulsive eating disorder. Substance abuse, gambling, and all these are not official psychiatric diagnoses, promiscuity or reckless driving, fast driving. So BPD is heavily stigmatized, even within the psychiatric community. This was a cover of a Time magazine from 2010. And you can see the circle part where it says borderline personality, this disorder that doctors fear most. And although in the 10 years since that was published, we've made progress, it's still, a lot of clinicians don't want to work with people that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder because they see us as manipulative and attention seeking, when really we are suffering terribly. And I just want to read you a quote from an anthology that was published in 2016 called Beyond Borderline, True Stories of Recovery from Borderline Personality Disorder. And there's 24 short essays about people who have recovered. I have an essay in it called Letting the Light In. But this is from the introduction and was written by Dr. Perry Hoffman, who founded the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder. Sadly, she passed away at the end of last year, but I'm just going to read this. Seldom does an illness, medical or psychiatric, carry such intense stigma and deep shame that its name is whispered or a euphemism coined, and its sufferers despised and even feared. Perhaps leprosy or syphilis or AIDS fits this category. Borderline personality disorder is such an illness. In fact, it has been called the leprosy of mental illnesses and the disorder with the surplus stigma. It may actually be the most misunderstood psychiatric disorder of our age. So that was only 4 years ago in 2016. So you can see the intense stigma that this disorder carries. So that's one of the reasons I started the organization, BWellBStrongBPD. I want to spread the word that recovery, that full and sustained recovery is possible. I want to dispel the myths and combat the stigma and let people know, other people know, both families and people who have been diagnosed, that they are not alone, and that with hard work and therapy that it can be done. So my life before BPD, I was, after college, I graduated from State University of New York at Buffalo. I was working full-time in advertising in New York City. I had played softball in college, so I was playing softball on 3 different teams, having to do with advertising and corporate teams in Central Park. I was addicted to cocaine, which is rampant in the advertising. That's how I got introduced to it. I entered therapy at 23 years old due to relationship issues. I had never had a boyfriend. I fell into a deep depression during that first therapy and made my first suicide attempt, which I kept a secret. I started cutting myself, and I developed anorexia, and I was hospitalized twice, the first time for 6 months and the second time for 4 months. And that was before managed care. And that's why those hospitalizations were so long. So after the second hospitalization for the anorexia, I had been working at as a consumer promotion development manager for one of the biggest packaged goods corporations in the world. And this is before the American with Disabilities Act. And they let me go, understandably. And I became extremely depressed and made my second suicide attempt. And I was hospitalized at a Dialectical hospital in the city. And that's when I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So they sent me up to New York Presbyterian Westchester here in White Plains. And they had a long-term unit for people with borderline personality disorder, which of course they don't have anymore. And it utilized innovative new therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, which at that time was groundbreaking. Marshall Linehan had just released her manual on it. And this was the first place on the East Coast to utilize it. So I stayed there for 10 months, again, before managed care. And it was a very immersive program. We had skills groups, we had individual coaching, we had homework, we had everything. It was the first place I met people like me. And I felt very safe there. And when the insurance finally, after 10 months, said, we're not going to pay anymore, the unit chief didn't think I was safe to go out into the community. And he was going to transfer me to Creedmoor, which is a state hospital in Queens where I grew up. And these are the transfer papers. And my mother stepped in, even though I was 30 years old, and she said, no child of mine is going to Creedmoor. And compromise was reached. And I went to a 24-hour a day, 7-day-a-week supervised residence. And I attended an outpatient dialectical behavior therapy day program, which was 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. Also specializing in people for BPD that the hospital had just opened. And I stayed at the halfway house for 3 years, again, you know, before managed care, and attended the day program. So what causes BPD? So although the research for borderline personality disorder lags about 20 years behind some of the other psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, they now know that it's a mixture of some brain disorder and environmental. So Marshall Linehan coined the term invalidating environment. And what that means is that the young person in the home or the child in the home doesn't feel like she matters. And her feelings or her very existence is invalidated, can be invalidated in one of several ways, through sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, or just neglect. There also have been doing, for the last several years, studies of the brain where they do the PET scans and the areas of the brain light up. And one of the studies has shown that people with BPD can recognize negative emotions when they're shown a face with an expression like a split second faster than other people without a diagnosis. So what that's telling them is that people with BPD are, generally sometimes born with a more sensitive temperament. And Marshall Linehan liked to say that people with borderline personality disorder walk around with like third-degree emotional burns. They're just that much more sensitive. And it's not their fault. It's not our fault. It's just the way we were born. So I've just thrown in some what caused my BPDs. I grew up in a chaotic household. My father was an alcoholic. He was very intelligent, and he never hit me, and I wasn't sexually abused, but he uses words to really hurt my brother and I. I was never good enough for him. Nothing I ever did was good enough for him. And I spent my entire life until he passed away in 2013 trying to please him. So that was the invalidating environment that I grew up in. And fathers are supposed to be the first role models for daughters' relationships with men, and he totally, screwed that up for me. So, that's what caused my borderline personality disorder and my relationship issues. So here's a couple of pictures from my childhood that my mother loved to dress us up. That was probably like the first day of school, probably like 3rd or 4th grade. You can see that I had very like hairy arms, and I used to get teased a lot and called gorilla arms and cried just all the time, and told I was too sensitive by everyone, by teachers, by everyone in my life. This is a 6th grade report card that I found when we were cleaning out my father's apartment, and you can see he wrote, "Could use more work." I was like 12 years old. And I mean, you could just, he was demanding, and nothing I ever did was good enough for him. So how did I cope with all this? I started smoking marijuana in high school at age 14. I smoked all the way through high school and college. When I started working, in the advertising, I swapped the marijuana for cocaine. And I loved that on top of the world powerful feeling that it gave me. I started starving myself. And that was another high. I started cutting, and that was to numb the emotional pain and just to feel something. And I made, the second suicide attempt was after I was diagnosed with BPD, and I made 4 suicide attempts in all. So I was pretty self-destructive. So what is DBT? So as I mentioned before, it was developed by Dr. Marshall Linehan out of the University of Washington. And she just came out with her memoir, I think last year. And she's revealed that she also suffered from borderline personality disorder, and she was determined to find, as she put it, help other people get out of that hell that is BPD. And DBT is a treatment that focuses on keeping people in the here and now. And it's made up of 4 modules. So mindfulness, emotion regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, and distress tolerance. And within each module are a number of skills that people with BPD learn. And depending on how long you're in a program, you just keep cycling through the modules because you can always learn something new and you can always improve your practice. So mindfulness, obviously back in 1990, no one had ever heard of mindfulness. I think there might've been like transcendental meditation or something like that. But mindfulness exactly is like something like following your breath, focusing on your breath, focusing on the here and now. It's a very non-judgmental stance. So in other words, if you're focusing on your breath and you hear a sound outside the window, obviously your attention is going to go to the sound outside the window, but you don't judge yourself for it. You don't say, oh, I failed mindfulness, I'm going to give up. You gently bring yourself back to your practice and just let it go. So as I mentioned, a lot of people with BPD have difficulty regulating their emotions. So they're giving coping skills to help them stop before they go shooting up to 100 or shooting down into the abyss and getting very depressed. A lot of people with also have problems with relationships. Like one day they'll come in and you'll be, you know, the best person in the world up on the pedestal, and you know, a person in their life could do something totally innocuous, and you'll be in the cellar, in the gutter, and you may not even know what you've done. So there's skills to address how to be more effective in your relationships. Distress tolerance is coping skills when you feel like urges to self-harm. Like on the unit, we were given rubber bands to snap against our skin, which is, you know, it stings, but it's a lot better than cutting yourself. And then you'd progress to stuff like self-soothing with the 5 senses, like looking at a sunset, or listening to music, or smelling like essential oils, and anything to take you out of that urge, which is temporary, to hurt yourself or harm, to engage in self-harming behavior. So even though my formal DBT training ended probably around in the early 2000s, I still really, I'm sorry, this is my, my distress tolerance animal. She's a rescue dog. I rescued her about 14 months ago. Her name is Shelby. She's probably around somewhere. So she's been a real help to me. Yeah, she's a sweetie. She's a sweetheart. So I don't get urges to self-harm, but I still get a lot of stress. So she helps me de-stress. So like I said, I continue to use my DBT skills, even though my last formal DBT therapy was in the early 2000s. And every time I use them, I learn something new to add to my practice. Excuse me. So there's been some longitudinal studies done on people with DBT, with BPD, it's like alphabet soup, but like 10 years out. And what they're finding is that the symptoms of self-harm and suicidality tend to remit with age. So in other words, about 80 to 90% of people, they won't be self-harming anymore. They won't have chronic suicidality anymore. But when you factor in what they mean by full recovery is being able to hold down a full-time job, being able to be in a healthy relationship, and that doesn't necessarily mean a romantic relationship. It means with friends, with coworkers, with bosses, in those kind of situations, that's the part that remains elusive, and that drops down to about 50 to 60%. So in 1998, I decided to go back to school and get my master's in social work. I had become fascinated with the process of therapy, and I just wanted to know how it worked, and I decided to become a therapist. However, I got my first full-time therapy job right after graduation, and I worked for 5 years at an outpatient clinic in Westchester. But as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, recovery is not linear, and you may have plans, but that's not necessarily how the world works. So in 2005, I fell into a really deep depression, very suicidal. I was hospitalized 6 times in 18 months. I lost my job. And I got referred to a new therapist. She was a psychiatrist, so she did my meds, and she was the rare type of psychiatrist that also did a new kind of therapy that was also developed to treat borderline personality disorder. It was known as TFP, or Transference Focused Psychotherapy. So unlike DBT, TFP is a psychodynamic treatment, not to be confused with psychoanalysis, but instead of staying in the here and now, you do explore your childhood, you do explore past relationships with your parents, with your siblings, with whomever is relevant. It starts out as a twice-a-week therapy. I had a contract, and a contract is part of the practice. My contract included if my weight dropped below a certain amount, I had to go inpatient on an eating disorder unit. If I cut myself even a scratch, I had to seek medical treatment before I could return to therapy. And if I attempted suicide, the therapist, I'll call her Dr. L, would do everything she could to save me and then end the treatment. Sounds kind of harsh, right? So the focus of the TFP is the transference, or the relationship between the therapist and the client. And the premise is that that relationship, as it develops, is thought to mirror all the other relationships in the client's life. So how I interacted with Dr. L is thought to hold up a mirror to the relationship in some ways I had with my father and my mother and my brother and my teachers and my boss and my coworkers. And through exploration and confrontation and interpretations, the therapist is very active in the therapy. It's not like, Freud in the blank slate. You come to gain insight and awareness into the patterns of your behavior, and you're able to, correct it. And the unconscious becomes conscious, and you're able to be aware when you're acting in this way, and then the next step is to act in a different way, a more productive way. So to give you an example, when I was actively anorexic, I developed this misguided sense of superiority, because I was able to, exist on, very low amount of calories a day, and I would watch people eat a lot more. And when I stopped engaging in the anorexia, I transferred this sense of superiority over to my job. And I was very much a perfectionist. And my last job before this one, I was given some administrative tasks to do. And I was not able to give myself validation for a task well done. But if I didn't get kudos and praise from my boss, I got very angry and resentful. And this was all unconscious. And I would go about self-sabotaging my job. And I would do this. I had developed very severe health anxiety. So I would call out sick. When I would, the symptoms would be real, but there would be nothing wrong, and I would end up in the ER, and I would miss a lot of work, and it threatened my job there because I was out so much. So you can see how all this was playing out. And through therapy, I came to realize what I was doing, and that the need for praise was also related to my father, and because I could never please him. So you see how everything's kind of tied in. And you know, I was able to gain awareness and say to myself, okay, this is what I'm doing. And over time, I was able to validate my own work and say, hey, Andrea, good job. So, I mean, all this is, as you can probably imagine, is a long, drawn out process. But this is how the therapy works, basically. This is one of the things that we worked on for a long time. So this is my younger brother. And when my mother passed away in 2002, he actually took on like a role of a parent because I was still so ill. And over time, through TFP, when I became healthier, our roles took on more of an equal and best friends. And then when he got married in 2018, he got remarried. He asked me to walk him down the aisle at his wedding. So that was a very meaningful moment for me. So Dr. L and I mutually terminated therapy at the end of 2016. We took the whole year of 2016 to terminate. I had been in therapy with her for 11 years. I had been in therapy since I was 23 for a total of 33 years. I really thought this was like a big achievement for me because there were times that I thought I would never be able to function without a therapist in my life. And I think a lot of you are probably wondering how I afforded like all this therapy. And like I said in the beginning, a lot of this was paid for before managed care. A lot of the long-term hospitalizations and a lot of the individual therapy was with the first couple of therapists when you just, you know, they gave you a receipt and you submitted to the insurance company and they just paid. And that was before managed care. And Dr. L, and although she was a psychiatrist and she didn't accept insurance, she very generously adjusted her fee depending on my financial situation at the current time. My mother helped out. She had a very successful business. And when she passed away, my brother helped me out. So I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to access the treatment I need through a combination of insurance and generous therapists and family support. So the difference between Dr. L and the other therapists that I saw is that with Dr. L, her door is always open. I mean, not only does she manage my medication, and I'll get to that in a second, is that if I need a booster session, I can call her and say, you know, do you have something open in the next week or two? And usually she'll find some time for me. I don't do it often, but it's good to know that she's available because I value her opinion and she knows me really well. I am on an antidepressant. I am on several antidepressants. I was managing on one, but in the spirit of honesty, in mid-2018, I suffered a stroke. And I'm fine except for some slight residual cognitive deficits. And I, understandably, I slid into a severe post-stroke depression and we adjusted my meds. So now I'm on 2 antidepressants and a second-generation antipsychotic, which is used often as an adjunct to antidepressants. And at some point in the future, we'll start weaning off one of the antidepressants probably. So to celebrate my 1 year strokes of recovery and my 1 year recovery from depression, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Project Semicolon. So I got a semicolon tattoo on the nape of my neck. And it's the semicolon represents a sentence the author could have ended, but chose not to. The author is you, and that sentence is your life. So it's a movement for people that self-harm and had suicidal tendencies and struggle with depression. And it's just to say, hey, we're still here. So it's been something that's very meaningful to me. So any questions?